they're missing the point that, I think UCSF did some data where they showed that having an embryoscope in their lab saves them the equivalent of one embryologist time per day. And if you look at the cost of an embryoscope, which is probably akin to about, 1 year embryologist salary, that it becoming more efficient with these devices will in the long run save you money, especially now when there's no embryologist to be found.
All of the change that is not happening in the IVF lab. We talk all about the automation that's coming to the IVF field in seemingly every talk at every conference, many episodes on this show. I want to know, why hasn't it happened already? Why isn't it happening faster? And so I explore those obstacles and barriers with my two guests on today's program. That's Dr. Eva Schenkman. She was a lab manager for a number of years at different practices. She has been a consultant. She now runs a program called ARTLAB, and I bring in her colleague, Helena Russell, and we talk about the barriers to implementing automation categorically in the IVF lab. We talk about the risk and inefficiency of data entry. We talk about the lack of trust in the data that comes from business intelligence software. Eva estimates that fewer than 10% of IVF labs have fully automated their data entry with business intelligence software. We talk about the Vienna consensus. Why has there been a lack of adoption in the Vienna consensus? Again, I asked Helena and Eva just to ballpark how many labs they think have adopted the Vienna consensus. And I'm asking them to do this off of the top of their head, but they think it's about half that have adopted some meaningful level of the Vienna consensus. We talk about other metrics that are meaningful for efficiency and safety that don't necessarily improve clinical outcome, but are necessary for improving safety, efficiency, and productivity. We talk about this cursed dynamic between delivery and operations, where you are on the hook for doing a certain number of IVF cycles. You're on the hook for serving a certain number of patients. You have to do that to make payroll, to keep the lights on, to keep the patients happy. Meanwhile, there's the operational systems behind that, which are another entity, another chore to solve. And those two things are at odds of each other in terms of what is prioritized now in the moment, and what needs to be prioritized and improved for the future and for ongoing delivery. Finally, Helena and Eva say that some solutions are not ready for prime time, and boy, do they go to town on naming who those folks are. No, they don't. I try to get them to, but of course they go hard on ideas and soft on people, as is generally good advice. So as a consolation for myself, I have them detail what they would like to see from RCTs, what they think is missing from solutions that are coming to the field, what they think needs to be proved in order for solutions to merit much wider adoption, and what IVF centers can do in the meantime to help prove the concept. Enjoy today's episode with Helena Russell and Dr. Eva Schenkman.
Dr. Schenkman, Eva, Ms. Russell, Helena, welcome to Inside Reproductive Health.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you.
I've finally fulfilled a promise, or I'm living up to a promise where I said I was going to create more IVF lab content than I have in the past. I think this year we've already done more episodes about the lab than we did in the first 3 years of the show combined. So I'm starting to have a rudimentary level of knowledge to where I can maybe start to ask more interesting questions. And one of the things that I want to talk about today is the obstacles behind the automation for the lab. So at a high level on the show before, I've talked about the automation that's coming to the lab. And I'd like to take advantage, speaking with each of you, about why it isn't happening faster, and probably have you unpack and give specific examples as we go. But maybe we start at a high level with just the automation that you're seeing in the lab happening right now that you weren't seeing 5 years ago and maybe not even 2 years ago. What's happening with regard to automation now?
One of the ways in which, I've been involved in some of my consulting activities in some of the automation is through data analysis. We spend an awful lot of time in the lab, crunching numbers. And in most labs, we still do it the same way we did 30 years ago, which is, we've usually got 2 or 3 different Excel spreadsheets. We've got one for data. We've got one for cryo. We may also be entering something into an EMR. And we used to sit there at the end of the month or the end of a quarter and spend, 2, 3, 4 days to crunch all of those numbers. So not only counting the amount of time that embryologists were spending putting in all that data, risking all those data transcription errors, now we've been using things, business intelligence software like Power BI to pull that data automatically out of the IVF EMRs to run that data in real time. So we kind of call that real-time analytics. So that I see as one of the key ways into which we can save, an enormous amount of time, making the labs, a lot more efficient, is on a data analysis standpoint. A lot of the big talks now at a lot of the meetings are on automation in the lab and efficiencies in the lab. And I think we can talk a little bit more about that, what the roadblocks are, to those. And, to a long way, I think a lot of the roadblocks are, one is cost. A lot of these devices, things like, an embryoscope, for example, are very expensive. And, a lot of physicians or a lot of practices expect to see, oh, I'm going to get this device, it's going to increase my pregnancy rates. It doesn't increase my pregnancy rates? Well, then I'm not investing that kind of money into it. But they're missing the point that, I think UCSF did some data where they showed that having an embryoscope in their lab saves them the equivalent of one embryologist time per day. And if you look at the cost of an embryoscope, which is probably akin to about, 1 year embryologist salary, that it becoming more efficient with these devices will in the long run save you money, especially now when there's no embryologist to be found. And I think some of the other issues I see with the automation is things are rushed to market quickly, at a very high price, and they don't necessarily have, a lot of the data behind it yet that, that it is going to be, just as safe or just the same as a senior embryologist. So I think kind of got, a couple of issues there, between the cost and the efficiency and making sure that, that we can get current staff to adopt, this new technologies.
Okay, so you give me a couple different avenues that I could further explore. Let's start with the spreadsheets. You mentioned having 2 or 3 Excel spreadsheets previously for which you needed for your data analysis. What were they? What were their roles, those spreadsheets and the information that they contain?
Everything from, you doing your pregnancy rates, your competency assessments, also your cryo inventory. We typically, for the most part, still keep paper worksheets in the lab. Very few of us are using, tablets or have gone paperless. So, we've got that paper, we're either scanning that paper into an EMR or, retyping that data into an EMR. And then typically a lot of the EMRs don't do data analysis very well. A lot of them don't have reports that follow the Vienna consensus, guidelines. So we're then keeping separate spreadsheets. So we're putting things into the EMR, putting things into, Excel spreadsheet for data analysis, and then typically having a third sheet for, cryo inventory. So we're entering everything, typically 3 times. And then having somebody, typically higher up, then do all of that data analysis, like I said, typically at the end of the month, sometimes at the end of the quarter.
How is QA done in this instance when you have 3 different sources of information, but they're all in different places? How is QA done so that the duplicative information is correct? Because anytime you have information in different sources that isn't uniformly exported, you always risk.
You typically in an Excel worksheet, you hope you catch it. There's not really a lot of formulas in there to kind of automate to pick that up. You're always going to get data transcription errors. Some of the things like Power BI can pick that up for you. But I think, honestly, a lot of times it gets caught when, you're giving a patient, data off of your cryo inventory spreadsheet, and a patient, or a nurse corrects you, well, that's wrong. That's not what we had. So that is a problem, with data entry errors, is we really don't have a good mechanism to ensure that the data is accurate.
So when you have 3 sources of info like that, you got your spreadsheet for cryo inventory, you're scanning into the EMR, and then you've got a separate spreadsheet for the data analysis. There generally isn't like an overarching QA for the data entry to make sure that they're all uniform?
No.
Okay, so even without regard to efficiency, there's still there's a risk there.
Yeah, absolutely. Your data is only as good as the information you're putting in.
You mentioned that is an area where clinics are starting to automate more and those spreadsheets are being supplanted, or that's something that you envision in the
No,
future?
there actually is a few systems out there. Several of the EMRs have been using business intelligence software, either through Tableau or through Power BI, and linking those with their EMRs to then automatically pull that data out of the EMR. So as soon as you've done your FERT check, as soon as you've done, your observation or the pregnancy data is entered in, it's pulling it into those Power BI sheets. And those not only then are automated, but they can even be set up to then alert you when there's a problem. So they can send you notifications that, hey, your ICSI-3PN rate is starting to creep up. So you can, definitely not only from an efficiency standpoint, but also from a troubleshooting standpoint. So I know, recently one of the media companies had an issue with some oil, for example, and that, typically tends to take a little bit of time until you're able to pinpoint what the problem is. And, the hope is that these automated systems would be able to pick up on something like that much quicker than you'd notice by eye, or, you got to wait till the end of the month. Obviously, if something's killing all your embryos, you'll notice that pretty quickly. But let's just say you've got, 25% drop in blast conversion rates. That may not be something you pick up so easily. Maybe you had some bad patients in there, but you can use a lot of that business intelligence software that's been used by the, financial industry and other industries for years. Now we can kind of harvest the power of that and use for the IVF labs.
Do you have even a ballpark guess of what percentage of IVF labs are now automating their data entry with business intelligence software?
Automating, I'd say single digits.
So very, very low.
Yep.
What's stopping it from being 80, 90, 100%?
I think one is trusting in the data. Two is we, for as much as we like to think we're ever changing, we don't actually like to change that much. We don't want to let go of our paper worksheets. We, this is what we've done for 30 years. We don't want to make mistakes in what we do. We know that, an Excel spreadsheet, as long as it's not, sorted wrong or tampered with, it will get you the data that you need. A lot of the EMRs don't necessarily have the best fertility modules. So, even, a lot of people in the lab, they're still using the paper worksheets and they're only scanning in their sheets. So one is, if you're going to use something like Power BI or Tableau, you really have to have a dynamic EMR to be able to use that with. So that's something a lot of the clinics struggle with. And I think just trusting in the data is a bit of a learning curve, to get going with it. And, I think slowly it's starting to come about, but, slowly.
By the way, Helena, anytime that you want to jump in, I tend to just riff off questions because
I did want to say a couple of things to kind of chime in with Eva. One thing what's really challenging is the learning curve, because it's not just trust, it's taking somebody who works with their hands and putting them into a situation where they're going to have to be working with computers more. And that can be a little daunting, but again, having the right tool and the right support from that tool helps. Something else that Eva just said is that they're not all of these EMRs are created the same. And that's true across healthcare industry in general. They're very unique. There are so many out there, and they do different things differently. And so there may be some that are a little bit better for gathering all the information that needs to be gathered, and also to be flexible enough. One thing that you may or may not realize about IVF is that not all IVF centers do things exactly the same way. So you have to be flexible, and the learning curve is one of the things that I think is challenging for people, and trust, like Eva said. Another way of automating that kind of tails into EMRs, and specifically EMRs built for IVF, is witnessing, which is an automated system these days with barcode reading or with radio frequency. And Eva might want to chime in on this one as well. She has a lot of familiarity with these. And those are also tying in with some of these IVF databases or electronic medical record systems. And again, pulling a lot of really good, valuable information from the lab into that system helps with, once we get to that point where we can do the analysis via Power BI, what we can then do is really target quality control, quality enhancement, and quality assurance.
Let's stay on that thread for a second before we get into workflow variance and the barrier of change. You mentioned one of the issues apart from that is trusting the data itself. So what is the cause for mistrust in data, or what is the risk of inaccurate or incorrect data in using business intelligence software for data entry?
When you're pulling data from an EMR, one of the problems is these EMRs are all structured differently. They're usually large back-end SQL databases. They may not be, so you can't take, 3 different EMRs, take a same Power BI software setup and plug it into these 3 different systems. They won't work. So these things have to be customized, unless it's something your EMR is already offering, they would then have to be customized to each setup. And a lot of it is just in that analysis, knowing, you might have 2,000 or 3,000 different fields on the back end to pull from. How is each lab recording that data? Where is that data sitting in these SQL, databases for analysis? I think some of it might be generational. I think, the first generation of embryologists, even though we are pretty good at using computers, we, for the most part, for the last 30 years, have done everything on paper. They've done everything, simply. The second we have to trust setting up those scripts and setting up something to the IT department, these things are very difficult to validate. So it's a lot of time. And one of the things we don't have right now is a lot of time in the lab. So I think part of that is having the time to validate these systems, to trust them. It would be very hard for a company to come in to develop a Power BI software that's applicable to all EMRs, because the EMRs are all structured differently. So they need to be done, on a customized or bespoke, level between each system. But I think it's just, as I said, I think it'll be different with this new generation of embryologists coming through. I think they expect it. They practically live with a phone, in their hand. I think they're going to be a bit more comfortable with having this data automated.
Well, so tell me a little bit more about what you mean by the time it takes to validate systems. Does that mean to pilot the program, to check the...
Yeah, I'm actually involved with one, right now, looking at some of these automated reports. And I have to go into the EMR and I put in test cycles, and I'm putting in different complicated ones with day 1 ICSI or with late FERTs and with thaw biopsy refreezes, combination cycles with fresh and frozen eggs. And all of these data sets are stored in different tables in the back end of the CMR. So I have to sit with the IT people and structure each of these queries. And, we test it on these cycles, and because how do you tell an IT person, when they're doing a competency for, good day 3 cleavage rate, for example, what does the word good mean? If you asked, 4 embryologists, you're going to get 5 different answers. And that's part of why, we rely on things like the Vienna consensus, as a standard, guideline to go through. But then, each and every clinic we roll these things out to has to validate it on their own, because none of us are doing recording data the same way. We all record it a little bit differently. We're all using different templates. We're all using, different embryo grading, criteria. So I think that's part of, a bit of the problem with it, I think. But, as clinics start to see the benefit of these systems, I think it'll be easier and easier. We get these things validated. We get a couple of hopefully key labs, incorporating them into their workflow. I think we'll kind of get the message out there that these systems are reliable, are trustworthy. And, that'll go a long way to really making the labs, more efficient. Everybody's talking about, lab on a chip and everything else. But, I think, when your embryologists are spending a significant amount of their time being admins, hand entering data, still using paper worksheets, we're a long way away from talking about, lab on a chip.
So how much chicken and egg is happening here? Like, if part of the reason why labs are slow to adopt the technology, they're slow to validate the systems because there's so much variance in workflow. People record data differently. They grade embryos differently. So that's the barrier, but it's also the result, isn't it? Like, if you had the universal systems implemented, that you might have a more universal way of recording data. You might have a more universal. Is that happening?
We have the Vienna consensus, the paper that was written for KPIs. I think that goes, along a great deal.
Okay. What is stopping people from categorically adopting this Vienna consensus across all labs?
I think for the most part, it's been very well, received. I think it's just it's the way we've been doing it for 30 years. It's that belief. It's worked for all this time. This is, and that belief that we're kind of all homegrown cooks in each of our labs. That we kind of do it our way. These are the KPIs that work for us. There are still some labs that are doing day 3 biopsy. As opposed to, blastocyst biopsy and slow freezing. It's just that ingrained, because we don't want to make mistakes in what we do. So in some ways, we're very reluctant to try new things. And part of that comes with doing it the same way. It's worked. We don't want to change it.
And so much hinges on it, right?
Yeah. And that first generation of embryologists is retiring. They're leaving the field. So, I think it's important to, this new generation, they're not going to sit there for the amount of hours and hours and hours that we spent typing into three databases. They want to enter things on a tablet. They don't want to enter things on paper and then transcribe. So, I think there is a lot of push from these newer embryologists to automate things, and hopefully, we'll get some significant changes.
They're more comfortable trusting the data, as Eva has said.
What percentage of labs if you can even ballpark it, do you suppose have adopted the Vienna consensus to, if not to the letter, 90%?
I'd probably have to say maybe, what do you think, Helena, close to 50?
Probably.
I still...
If they're not accepting all of them, they're probably focusing in on a few, don't you think, Eva?
I think so. I'm still surprised how many lab people I speak to who haven't heard of it. And, as I said, each one typically has their own KPIs.
Thank you, Eva. Now I don't feel as dumb for asking.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate, and I think it's a lack of communication in our field, but I also think that what we're doing is very difficult. And so the challenge is making sure that we continue to be able to produce what it is our patients need and to meet our patients' needs. I mean, there's no excuse for failure. And so when you have something working, it's difficult to hear what somebody else is saying if it doesn't mean an improvement, which I think Eva kind of hit on earlier. Unless you can show a positive outcome, and it may be that they'd rather spend that extra money to have somebody do something in a less efficient way, than trust in something that may or may not give them the outcomes that they are looking for.
Yeah, is it difficult to trust in the scripts that are written by someone, with a computer background that, you as an embryologist don't really understand? So as I said, that's why the validation of it is so important. Get them seeing that this data is accurate and is pulling correctly. And, I think, to be able to have an automated system like that, then alert you not only when something is out of range, but is deviating towards being out of range, I think will be invaluable. And this one issue that recently developed with oil is now resulting in a class action lawsuit. So I think, anytime we can develop something that would pick up on these things, not only tell us what our pregnancy rate is and what our individual embryologist competency rates are, but to be able to then alert us to any troubleshooting issues in the lab, that we don't have to wait 6 weeks. Now we see something in our data analysis. Now we have to try to figure out what it is. And that's where we're using AI is also going to help at some point, with analyzing this data.
So I'm understanding if there's not a clear clinical outcome that lab directors can see of in terms of success rates, that there often isn't the impetus to impose a change. And I see the agents working against change. We've done it this way forever. It's worked this way forever. We have a big variance in workflow from one place to another. So just because it worked for these guys over here doesn't mean that I know that it's gonna work over here. But at this point, why isn't the shortage of embryologists and the constraint on embryologists' time enough to have made a bigger catalyst for change? Like, to me, it seems like, okay, if success rates are equal, but I can get back an embryologist day every time that we use this or solution, or I can get back this many hours of embryologist time. Why is that not enough of a catalyst to be seeing way more automation than we're currently seeing?
Part of it has to do with time. It takes time to train somebody to do something new. If you're so overwhelmed in your lab or your IVF facility and you don't have enough time to train a new person, you don't have time to learn something new. Don't you think, Eva?
I think so. And I think it's just that, exactly that you don't have time to train something new. It's that chicken and egg, scenario again. I'm so overwhelmed. I not only have time to not train somebody, and then you say, oh, well, get this piece of equipment or whatever for automation. There is going to be a period of time where that, system is going to actually take you more time until you're able to be proficient at it and you're able to realize its efficiency. And, not a lot of people have the patience for that much time for adopting it, and the cost. All of these automated systems are very expensive. So getting physicians and groups and practices, it's easy to say I need another embryologist and they'll pay, 6 figures plus for an embryologist. You see a body sitting there. To pay 6 figures plus for a piece of equipment sitting on the counter, you don't see the efficiency savings as easily as you see another body sitting there. So I think that's part of it. And without them seeing, like, as I said, I go back to time lapse, there was just, paper recently that, basically is, we shouldn't be, looking at time lapse because we didn't see an improvement in pregnancy rate, but you're missing, the picture of it. You're missing, the safety of it. You're not having to take the embryos out to look at them. You can monitor embryos remotely, so if there is, more COVID outbreaks or another pandemic, you can check fertilization from home. And, just that.
You could centralize embryologists, couldn't you? Or at least part of that workflow?
You could. You have off-site lab directors could monitor things remotely. They can log in and look at the embryos, look at how they're growing, pull the data. You can see these Power BI apps. You can see all of your data on your mobile device. You can even see the images of your embryos on your mobile device. So I think it's that cost barrier, but it is that learning barrier that it's just not something, new that we've done. And, I think, I think next year's, there'll be some workshops, some of the meetings that are going to be focusing on future of technology and innovation, and where things are going to be, but not just theoretical, but actual practical. What's here, what's now, what can we kick the tires on now? And part of that is training and having these new innovative systems launched at training centers and having embryologists come in and use them, because nobody wants to practice on a real patient. You need to be able to have a place that's comfortable, that you can go in and, learn this in an environment that's not stressful, not while you're trying to do real patient samples, that you have a place to get comfortable with these devices and to, learn how they work.
And where all monitoring is integrated. And I mean, looking at your incubator, your temperature, your CO2 level, your oxygen level, looking to see if your liquid nitrogen tank is got enough liquid nitrogen in it, making sure your refrigerators are performing up to par, and having those be part of your automated integrated system so that you literally have every function that you would normally assign to possibly, an intern or a novice embryologist, somebody who's a junior who's just coming in. Instead, you can have continuous monitoring, which I think is extraordinarily reassuring. Probably there's a role for someone or a company out there to help clinics bundle and to become efficiency experts. I think one of the things that our training center does is help expose new embryologists, and even in workshops where we're opening up our center to experienced embryologists to come in to have 1 or 2 day workshops, they will be exposed to those kinds of integrated systems as well. And, a lot of it has to do with, I can hear about it all day long. I can read about it all day long. But if I can touch it and I can move the dials and nobody's sample is going to get hurt by that, and I can actually download an app and do it on my own phone or my iPad while I'm in this training center,
The exposure that you're talking about in the training center accounts for some of the issues, the distrust in the data, the lack of familiarity, the validation of the system, accounts for some of them. Some of the things that it doesn't, like what you've been talking about, is something that I've been obsessing over with regard to my own business and business in general, and I think we can apply it to the IVF lab, and that is delivery versus operations. And often when you hear business books or you hear business talks, operations and delivery are almost used interchangeably. Like delivery meaning the fulfillment of the good or service which we've sold or promised, and operations is really the system behind it. So if we're roofers, our delivery is we're going to have a new tear-off roof on your house by the end of April. That's the delivery. And we have an obligation, once that roof is sold, to fulfill that delivery. You could use delivery and fulfillment interchangeably, but operations is the system behind that delivery. So delivery is getting the roof on the darn house, getting it done by the date we said we were going to get it done by. But operations is what types of materials we buy, the workflow behind it, who we assign to the job, how the job is assigned and accounted for and reported on, the QA that comes after it, the what we automate or don't automate, and so all of that is operations. And there's a tension between delivery and operations because you have delivery obligations. You have patients cycling through, and you have a finite number of embryologists that can work on those embryos while those patients are being served, while you need to make this institutional change at the operational level. So how do you solve for that? How, with specific to the IVF lab, how do you begin to relieve some delivery obligations while investing in the operations that will ultimately result in a virtuous cycle?
Part of what we have here, as opposed to just also having, kind of a training facility, is our training facility is a fully functioning mock IVF lab. So one, to have all of these different systems communicating here so that when people do come and try them, it's not just trying one piece of it. It's kind of seeing, the entire system working as if this was a functioning lab. The other thing we have to convince them of is what to do when it goes down. Because that's one of the most common things, I hear, that if we're going to be entering things on a tablet or we're going to be entering things, on our mobile device, patient data is potentially going up into the cloud. Nobody trusts that. So, it's the redundancy that's built in. Are we going to do, backups to our local desktop? Are we going to print out, a daily report? Because what are you going to do when there's a hurricane that comes through or a tornado? Like, what are you going to do if a natural disaster comes through? I always have my paper. I always have my paper chart. But there's that trust in what you can't see. And, we're all used to the internet going down, the Wi-Fi going down. But as an embryologist, you still have to do your job. And if everything is up in the cloud and you come in, you got no Wi-Fi, how do you know what patients to do the FERT checks on, or how do you know what patients to do the freeze on, or which embryos to thaw? So, we do need to get better at ensuring, what we're going to do from a redundancy standpoint to be sure that those concerns are addressed. And, I think as manufacturers out there, we need to play a bit better in the sandbox with each other and, working on ways to get these systems communicating better with each other, because each one, is kind of fine on its own, but there are these own little islands that aren't interacting very well with each other. They're very clunky, not very quick. So, we do need a lot of development still in those areas. But, and I think, the only way is to have kind of testing labs, where we can kind of kick the tires on these things and bring embryologists in and sit and use them.
Well, just to add to a lot of what we see in other industries, like the banking industry, a lot of what they do is done in the cloud. And, they have very, very strict rules and regulations. And other healthcare branches of healthcare industry, these people are doing a lot of commerce in the cloud, a lot of data storage in the cloud. And those redundancies have to be backed up by a robust IT support system. So they do exist for some of the systems that, we've been talking about, sort of loosely, but the really good ones are going to have that kind of support and structure so that you can, assure those who are using it, hey, that information is going to be there. And they have to have an offline, like a holding place at their own facility, a server that information can be stored on.
I still see a lot of doctors' practices, their servers are in a closet down the hall.
Yeah.
And,
not in the clouds.
Yeah. That, we don't really hear, it's not really openly discussed, but, we get a lot of clinics, there's a lot of clinics that are hit with ransomware. And, a lot of that is kind of kept swept under the rug. And that's something that we need to, why do we not have as strict regulations as the financial industry as far as how we're keeping this data, where we're keeping this data, redundancy.
If you're thinking about automating and you're thinking about going down this road with an EMR, ask the really important question. And that is, how is this stored? What is your security structure? How is it done? And who's handling that? Because, you have to have a very robust system, and it has to be redundant. It can't just be stored in one place. It has to be stored in multiple places. And how that is done is actually critical, not only to the security of your data, how you trust your data, the validation of the systems, but also whether or not you can move forward and practice one day. If somebody holds you for ransom, you're stuck.
Well, that solves for the issue of redundancy. It solves for a lot of the issue of implementation. But a lot of what you described is still the challenge of delivery versus operations. A lot of the reason why people have their server in a closet down the hall is because they've been so busy fulfilling delivery commitments, meaning seeing patients, doing retrievals, doing transfers, and all of the lab work on the other side of that they have not had the time, money, energy to focus on the overall operation systems. You happen to have a program that takes care of a lot of the risk. It allows people to visit, allows people to do this without putting their own things at risk and taking their own, having to test everything within their own system. But they still have to say, all right, well, I've got, maybe I've got 4 embryologists and I need 7. And so how am I going to send you one of my 4 embryologists when I'm already half staffed? And so how do you begin to solve for that?
One of the things we've been doing is offering, several kind of intensive, lengthy courses a year. We, and Helena primarily has been going out to the universities. We have someone who also works with us doing, on TikTok, doing TikTok videos of getting those students out here to, for training. So they typically come to us for 10 weeks, and we teach them everything from andrology to biopsy. We don't expect that these new embryologists could go back to their clinic and, be doing biopsy on day 1. But, the typical, in the old school apprenticeship style, it would take between 2 and 4 years to train one embryologist. And we're losing embryologists at a much quicker rate than we can replace them. So if not only, the training school that we have, but the other ones that exist in the country, we believe that we're able to now get that training once they're at the clinic down to under 12 months, so that we can speed up their training. So if you've got 4, you need 7, well, we can send you, we are churning out embryologists. Every embryologist that has been through here, I know every embryologist that has been through, one of the other programs in California has had a job offer. They're all, getting employed, and, we need to bring through more embryologists, and replace them at even a faster clip. And that's the only way. We can't any longer do this apprenticeship where it takes 2 to 4 years to get one new embryologist. It's not sustainable. We need a better way of bringing them up, bringing them through quicker, getting them trained. And, the style that we do it here, which is very intensive, they spend probably close to about 500 hours, doing literally every procedure, and, over the course of about 2.5 months.
Hundreds of times. They do each procedure hundreds of times. So what we're doing is setting them up to make it easier for those who are doing the training on site in the IVF lab, making it easier for them to get the embryologists they need. I do think that part of the operational pushback is there needs to be kind of somebody who could bundle. I really do believe that there's another role out there for IT, an IT biologist or something, somebody who could go into a lab and do a consultation and say, and Eva really has that kind of a perspective. She may not be the IT expert, but she has, a really good perspective on, hey, you're doing this, and this. Here are some products, and, we can put all these things together and deliver them to you. And, here's our IT redundancy expert, can come in, look at your system right now and say what needs to happen and what tools can we bring in here that are going to meet your needs? What need do you have? Do you want to do all your quality control remotely? Do you want to do your embryo analysis remotely, your embryo culture analysis remotely? Do you want to bring all your data together so that you can meet your KPI with a click of a button, review your KPIs, and then bring all of those things together and act as a liaison between all these different groups? Because it is a little mind-boggling when you look at what is happening in the IVF field, and you have, this automated system and this automated system and this automated system and this automated system. How do you bring all of those things together? That's the challenge. And not everybody's going to want all those things. So how do you do that? That part of that operation could be someone who's an expert at all these different things, helping to give advice, consulting, and charging a fee to bring it all together for them and stitch it together.
Zelena, you were talking about the challenges in having so many different automation solutions. One solution to that problem of having so many is having a consultant or an umbrella solution of some kind that can bring them together. But how much of the problem is also those solutions not integrating with each other, not integrating with the EMR? How common is that?
It happens all the time. And Eva spoke to that earlier, that people in these different realms need to play well in the sandbox. They need to be able to open up their systems a little bit so that they can speak to each other, push and pull data. Because a lot of times you'll see, well, one company will let you do one thing, but not the other, and you need both. And, I think that's an operational hurdle. And again, an integrator, somebody who really is quite savvy and knows, how to communicate with these folks, could hopefully bring some of this together. I know of, at least one company who's doing things like that. I'm sure there are plenty of others that are attempting that. It's a daunting task. We know that. We know it's very difficult to change. But one of the things that the light at the end of the tunnel, you're never going to stop changing in IVF. That's just plain and simple it. You're not going to reach a pinnacle and say, "Oh, we're done now. We've reached the pinnacle," because something new is going to happen. down the road, something new, some new way of doing analysis. And so you're going to always have to change. You're going to have to learn to live with that. And like Eva has said, some of the newer generation, they're used to maybe looking at things a little differently, maybe not so much always changing, but at least the electronic aspect of it doesn't seem like it's so...
it's not as daunting.
Not as daunting, not as much of a trust issue. I can't trust my computer. It gets viruses, right? Or I can get malware. So I think that, if you have the right systems and the right checks and balances, the right security systems and redundancies, as we've said, you will begin to, get over that hurdle. That's one of the biggest ones.
But if they don't integrate, aren't we back to the same challenge of the spreadsheets?
A lot of them are integrating. Yes, we are. If they don't integrate, a lot of them are seeing the handwriting on the wall. I think, Eva, wouldn't you agree?
I think so. Yeah.
Seeing the handwriting on the wall in that they're not being adopted if they don't integrate? Or...
They've got to make themselves a lot more malleable in order to be adopted, like you just said. If we're trying to show people how to use a KPI and the system that is giving you your best data and is not, handing it over, that you have to actually export it and upload it a different way that may be not as user-friendly, you might do it, but if somebody else down the street will integrate, guess who's going to get bought?
So there might be a market response that forces people to integrate more. You had, in the beginning of the conversation, you alluded to some solutions maybe not coming to market, but not having the scientific proof that they have a great benefit. What are some examples of that?
Well, I think Eva would agree that there are some products out there that we need to more closely scrutinize. And
names.
I'm not going to do that. But I will say that they're artificial intelligence based. But the issue with some of these is, the gold standard in scientific medical research is the randomized control trial. And some of these products, they may have them in progress, but as far as I know, not really have published as much as they should or at all. And so one of the things that I think we need to, as a scientific community, which is what IVF is a part of, is that before we fully buy in or spend an awful lot of money on something, that maybe we volunteer to be part of that study. If you're an IVF center and you're interested, say, okay, I'll be part of this study in order to help advance this field so that we'll know one way or the other. What they're promising may not be that we have better outcomes necessarily, but that we might have more efficient outcomes, which might lead to better outcomes because maybe your embryologists won't be so incredibly stressed out all the time because they can't function, because they can't get all their work done, because there's not enough of them. And this automation could become part of the workflow that holds an answer for them, at least part of an answer.
And I think that I agree with Helena. The biggest issue is especially, right now, the flavor of the month is kind of anything AI. And, each of them have some papers coming out that they're showing that this system's the best or that system's the best. But there's really a lack of well-planned, set up, very rigorous, those randomized controlled studies. And that's really because what happens is people then adopt it and they don't see the same benefit in their hands. So there's a big distrust of it when, you have for-profit companies who are then also sponsors of these papers who are putting out data saying that this is the best thing ever. And then when somebody pays the money and adopts the system, they're not seeing, the same, return on their end. So, I think, that's probably the one thing in this field that I think has hurt us, that we don't do, as many well-planned RCT studies, that, we do a lot of retrospective, a lot of, prospective, but not necessarily a gold standard, study.
Which is hard to do. I mean, in IVF, it's very difficult to do that.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to do certain kinds of randomized control trials because you do not have, that many chances for fertility in many cases who are coming to you for treatment. If you're going to do a randomized control trial, it's got to be planned in such a way to limit the harm or potential harm for the patient. What's harm? Harm is maybe they don't get pregnant. And so, in these cases, when you're looking at artificial intelligence, as long as you have a good check and balance, like you're having your own technicians review and respect what's coming out, but review what's coming out of the AI and make sure that, whatever it is it's telling you, you have the human aspect that you've learned to, know and love and you trust, then, oversight is good. But what does randomized control trial mean? And what does blinded mean? Because a lot of times bias, unfortunately, enters into these things. And how do you create a study where there's limited bias, meaning that, you're not overtly influencing the people who are conducting the study, the doctors, even the patients, and certainly the embryologists. How are you ever going to blind the embryologists? Probably not, never. You're probably never going to blind them because they're going to have to keep the numbers straight. Somebody has to protect the patient's embryos and make sure they really truly understand. They know this is embryo 1, 2, 3, 4. This is embryo 3, 4, 5, 6, and make sure everything is working properly. So blinding the embryologist is almost impossible.
Which RCTs would you like to see happen with regard to AI companies entering the lab space? Like, can you detail what you would like to see in an RCT or a couple RCTs?
I mean, Eva, you talked about this the other day with the AI that you were thinking about. That I think one of the things that we need to see is more numbers, also consistency in how the training database is working. So how you build that artificial intelligence is by having, a large enough number of input and outcomes, so you have something that you're observing, right? And you're applying an algorithm to it. And then what comes out the end is, hey, do it this way or select this embryo. And so if you have a large enough database, you could potentially apply that. One of the biggest problems that we have is applying it across the entire world. Probably not doable because in each and every lab or each and every IVF center, there may be some variables that we really have no control over, that we have to kind of focus in on that particular lab, and having enough data to have an artificial intelligence algorithm built may not be possible on a center by center basis. So some of these things, I think it takes time to develop the algorithm and then apply that to a randomized control trial where you're looking at either isolating the artificial intelligence and doing it with sibling embryos, for example. So you have to have a special population of patients who have enough embryos that you could put them in two different systems and compare them, or potentially looking at larger populations. If you don't have those sibling embryos to look at, you could look at groups of individuals in those two different isolated different ways of producing the embryo, for example. So it goes beyond what we're currently doing in the lab, which is observational. When we look at time-lapse imaging, we're looking at changes over time. Those are very interesting markers because you could see slow development versus fast development versus abnormal development. And you can see all that in a time-lapse imager. This is something that you could never see as the traditional way of analyzing embryos to pick for transfer is a particular time point, and looking at an individual, time point is not as superior as looking at, time time points throughout the developmental process over the 5 to 6 or 7 day period that we have them in culture. And what Eva's talking about is even more specific and more precise, and that is going after those molecular markers where you look at gene regulation. Those kinds of subtleties are almost impossible to, you may not see anything, but and the embryo may be developing perfectly well. It just looks like a normal embryo. But when you actually look at the molecular profile and look at the genes that are upregulated or downregulated compared to the perfect environment, well, you can't replace something like that. And in past times, some of the things that people have looked at are metabolomics. I don't know if you've ever heard that word, but it's okay. An embryo is growing and we're looking at metabolites of growth. And you siphon off some of the culture fluid and you look to see, is it metabolizing well? But actually looking at gene regulation and looking at markers that are very fine detail of the health of an embryo could be a potential answer.
I appreciate you both giving me so much insight into the different obstacles that are inhibiting automation from fully taking the IVF lab by storm. How would you like to conclude with regard to what needs to happen in order for automation to take its full rightful place in the IVF lab?
I think what we need to do are some very detailed studies where we look at how the impact of these automations on, first adopters. There's always going to be a group of people who say, I'm there with you. I want to go automation all the way. I want to do these things that are going to assist us in prevailing and thriving and moving forward. Those first adopters should be studied, and efficiency should be studied. We should study all aspects of their turnaround time for troubleshooting, their, catching things on the fly when there's a detail that's out of place for their QC. Their daily QC is messed up and they get an automated announcement. And, there are people who are malleable to this. They will be early adopters. And so those are the folks that we really need to study. We need to present at meetings. We need to maybe create the perfect training environment like we have here at ARTLAB, where you can bring people in, expose them to this integration and say, okay, this is how it could work in your lab. You show them something and that barrier may not be eliminated, but it's going to come down a little bit.
Helena Russell, Eva Schenkman, thank you both so much for coming on Inside Reproductive Health.
You've been listening to the Inside Reproductive Health podcast with Griffin Jones. If you are ready to take action to make sure that your practice thrives beyond the revolutionary changes that are happening in our field and in society, visit fertilitybridge.com to begin the first piece of the fertility marketing system, the goal and competitive diagnostic. Thank you for listening to Inside Reproductive Health.